Connected by purpose, driven by passion. This is Children's Healthcare Canada's Spark Live webinar series.
Children's Healthcare Canada would like to thank our Keystone funding partners for their ongoing contributions that support all of our programs and activities, including this Spark Live webinar series. Spark Live is where we gather each week to curate, convene, and showcase excellence and innovation from across the child and youth healthcare community. Our goal is to spark conversation, ideas, and action. There are two options to join in on the live conversation. Questions and comments for our panel or presenters can be typed into the question box, and comments that you wish to share with the audience can be typed into the chat box, visible to all of our attendees. For those of you on Twitter, tag @ChildHealthCan on any webinar-related tweet or use the hashtag SparkLive. And to keep up to date on all of Children's Healthcare Canada's webinars and other activities, be sure to sign up for our Spark Bulletin by visiting our website at childhealthcan.ca.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Children's Healthcare Canada's Spark Live webinar series. I'm Paula Robeson, your host for the next hour. Children's Healthcare Canada acknowledges that our offices, located in Ottawa, are on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. We also recognize the contributions that Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made, both in shaping and strengthening this community, our province, and the country. Today, we're delighted to bring you Pathways in Autism Spectrum Disorder, Part 2, Strengths and Assets from Multiple Perspectives. This webinar is the second of a three-part series. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Pat Miranda is the Professor Emerita in the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology and Special Education, and past Director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Research and Collaboration in Autism at the University of British Columbia. She is a doctoral level board-certified behavior analyst and has published over 150 research articles and chapters. Dr. Catherine Tombeau-Coste is a research associate in the Department of Neurosciences and Mental Health in the Research Institute and in the Department of Psychiatry at the Hospital for Sick Children. She applies innovative research and statistical methods to understand the differential contributions of biology, psychology, and sociological variables to parent and child mental health. And Dr. Anat Zadman-Zait is the Associate Professor in the School of Counseling is the Associate Professor in the Department of School Counseling and Special Education at Tel Aviv University and Affiliate Scholar at the Human Early Learning Partnership at the University of British Columbia. Her research is focused on coping processes, mental health, and well-being among families and their children with autism, aiming to improve the lives of neurodivergent children and their families. Just a reminder that we record all our webinars. As mentioned in the introductory video, please type your questions into the question box at any time. I'll prompt you via the chat as well, and I'll pose your questions to our guests following the presentations. It's now my pleasure to pass the mic to Pat.
Thanks, Paula, and welcome everyone to this seminar on strengths and assets from multiple perspectives as part of the Pathways in ASD series. I want to begin by acknowledging that the UBC Vancouver campus is located in unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. In addition, Catherine is located at the University of Toronto on land that for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and Catherine is grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. In addition, today, our thoughts are with the families, the communities, the residential school survivors, and all who mourn for the 215 children whose remains were found on the grounds of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School last week. We support having the children return to their families and communities with proper protocols. May we honor their lives and the survivors, and may we never forget their stories. As I said, today's the second in a series of 3 webinars. And I want to give you a little bit of background on the Pathways study aims in case you missed the first webinar where that was introduced. Pathways has taken a participatory research approach in this work that involves researchers, families, autistic people, educators, policy makers, and clinicians. And we've been working on the Pathways in ASD study since 2004, having enrolled over 400 Canadian youth and their families from 5 provinces at that point in time. We take a developmental perspective in this project, charting the growth and development of individuals on the autism spectrum from the time of diagnosis through to the time that they entered preschool, into the school years, and now they are all in adolescence, and we are graduating many of them at age 18 or 19. The project has taken an ecological approach from the outset, looking at individual factors, family factors, service factors, school and community factors that change over time in order to generate evidence for more flexible, developmentally appropriate policies and practices across Canada. From the outset, the Pathways study has taken a perspective of what's now referred to as positive psychology. And I want to differentiate positive psychology from like regular psychology, I guess, by sharing a quote with you. Here's the quote. For more than a century, psychology has been fascinated with the cliched question, what is wrong with you, Johnny? Since the dawn of this millennium, however, positive psychology has seriously urged psychologists to also probe into a much deeper and loftier question, what are you good at, Johnny? And that's really the focus of the pathway studies that we want to share with you today. What are you good at? So I'm going to turn this over to Catherine now, and she's going to take you through the first study, the one that we refer to as the Doing Well study.
Thank you, Pat, for your excellent introduction to our approach. I'll be discussing our work on different ways we can think of doing well and what that might mean. So first, a lot of literature focuses on a good outcome, but this is a bit challenging for a couple of reasons as we try to nail down what a good outcome is. So who should be the informant for a good outcome? And who decides what good outcome means? Like, what is a good outcome, actually? And what criteria need to be met for an outcome to be called good? And when is an outcome? Is it in your mid-20s? Is it when you're 45 years old? Is it when you're 85 years old? So to address some of these concerns, we thought about different ways we could define good. First, we went with the traditional way good has been defined as meeting a specific preset threshold of competence to be met, regardless of your starting level. And we call this proficiency in our study. The second way we defined good was to understand that growth, improvement, doing one's own personal best was also good. So here we set an amount of improvement between 2 time points and set that as growth in our study. Next, we need to address the idea of an outcome, which seems a bit premature to define in childhood. There's so much more life to live. And since we're focusing at only one time point in middle childhood, this is a snapshot at one moment, which rather than being a good outcome is more like doing well right now. So now that we have an idea of how we want to define good using the proficiency metric and the growth metric, and we have an idea of this as doing well, we need to decide on which domains to include in our study. Some early focus groups with the pathway parents identified domains that they felt were important, including communication, social skills, independent living skills, physical health, emotional health, and educational achievement. In our study, we selected 5 of these domains, including communication, daily living skills, socialization, and for emotional health, we looked at internalizing behaviors like anxiety and mood symptoms and behavior problems. So now we have our domains. We need to know who was in our study. We had 272 participants who were assessed in these domains in early childhood, around 3 to 4 years old. And again, in middle childhood, around 9 to 11 years old. For our proficiency metric, we looked at how children were doing in each of these 5 domains at 9 to 11 years old. And for our growth metric, we calculated the change in score in each of these 5 domains from early childhood to middle childhood. Now we know what we have measured: communication, daily living skills, socialization, internalizing behavior, and behavior problems. We know how we measured it with a proficiency metric and with a growth metric. We can now see how common doing well is in each of the 5 domains by each of the metrics. Along the horizontal axis, we have each of the 5 domains. And along the vertical axis, we have the number of participants. In the darker shades of purple, we have children who are doing well by growth or by proficiency or by both. That is, children who demonstrated both significant growth in a domain and achieved proficiency in that domain as well by middle childhood. In the lighter purple, we have children who did not attain proficiency or growth in these domains in our study. What we can see is that 46% of children are doing well in communication. 45% of children are doing well in internalizing behavior, and more than half of children, 56%, are doing well in behavior problems in middle childhood. Our next question is, how common is it to be doing well in multiple domains? Along the vertical axis, we have the percent of children participating in our study, summing to 100%. In the darkest shade of purple, we have children who were doing well in all 5 domains assessed. And in the next lighter shade of purple, we have children who are doing well in 4 of the 5 domains assessed. On up to the lightest shade of purple, indicating children who were not doing well in any of the domains assessed in our study. We see here that 35.2% of children are doing well in 3 or more domains. That 57.2% of children are doing well in 2 or more domains, and only 20.7% of children were not doing well by either of our metrics in the 5 domains assessed in this study. Our next question was to ask what factors might be associated with doing well by each of the metrics, proficiency and growth, and then separately in each of the 5 domains. First in proficiency, then in growth. We had to decide what factors we wanted to include in this analysis. We included some child-specific variables, such as the child's early ability within a domain, but also cognitive function, language abilities, and assigned sex. But we also understand that a child exists within a family, and a family exists within a sociocultural context. And so we also included contextual variables such as household income, parent coping with stress, and family functioning. For different metrics and different domains, there were different patterns of factors associated with doing well. However, when we look at these results broadly, we see that the factors associated with doing well are the very early childhood ability in a domain, language abilities, household income, and family functioning. Our last question in this study was about doing well and ASD severity. How is doing well related to ASD severity at 9 to 11 years old? We had already determined the proportion of children identified as having proficiency or growth in each of the 5 domains. We then determined the proportion of children who scored above and below the cutoff for ASD on the ADOS, i.e. scores less than 4, recognizing that symptom severity is a continuum. We used a statistical test to estimate the agreement between ADOS classification and doing well, and found little agreement between meeting ASD criteria on the ADOS and doing well in any domain by either the proficiency metric or the growth metric. So our metrics in these domains are not indications of ASD severity, but rather of doing well independent of ASD symptoms. Autism severity and doing well are not the same thing. In summary, doing well is not uncommon, and this gives us room for optimism. A child can be doing well in one domain, but not another domain. And a child can be doing well by proficiency, but not by growth, and vice versa. So we need to target all aspects of developmental health in our programs. Third, doing well is related to individual factors and contextual factors, which means we really need to provide family-level supports and services. Finally, these different definitions of doing well can occur even in the context of still having a diagnosis of ASD, meaning that diagnostic status is not the defining attribute of doing well. Thank you. I will now turn over the floor to my colleague, Annette.
So hi, everyone. I will describe our next study entitled Best Things. And in this study, we wanted to examine the character trait of children with ASD as identified by their parents and educators. So starting at time 1 of the study, which was kind of around 4 months since diagnosis, and each time point thereafter, parents completed a version of the child behavior checklist, which is a quantitative questionnaire, but also include an open question that asks parents to describe the best things about their child. After children enter school, educator also completed the teacher report form, which is a similar version of the CBCL, that again asks the teacher then to describe the best things about the student. So who was in the study? We had at time 1 with about 153 parents who completed the question, the open question, and the mean age was around 3 years old of their children. And then when they enter school, it was about kind of 7 years old. And at time 3, when children were about 10 years old. And we can see that the majority of the kids, as expected, are boys. So to code parents' open responses, we use the values in action classification of strength, which called also in short VIA. And this was our framework to code each responses that were written in free text by the parents. We also added some additional character trait or categories that parents mentioned frequently, but were not included in the VIA. So we added some categories and I will describe them later. So the 3 of us actually coded all responses independently, and then we compared our coding, discussed any differences, and we made a final coding decision. So to give you some sense of the coding framework, the VIA includes various character traits that are organized under content-related categories. So here you can see the category wisdom and knowledge, and it's in the middle. And around it are the different traits that are associated with this category, which include creativity, curiosity, open-mindedness, love of learning, and intelligence. In the next category is the courage, and we again see the related traits: bravery, zest, authenticity, and perseverance. And the next category is humanity. And again, you can see the different traits. Here we have love, social intelligence, kindness, and friendliness, which actually was added by us. In the category justice, we had teamwork, fairness, and leadership. And then the next one, temperance, and you can see the different traits that are associated with it. And the next one is transcendence, which again has different traits, including hope, spirituality, gratitude, humor, and appreciation of excellence and beauty. In terms of the categories that we add, so first there was appearance, which actually was added in 2006 to the VIA, and it's included the trait attractive. And then based on parents' description of their kids, they added a category of happiness, which included happy, and also they referred to their children's interest. So we had both under the category of interest, we had both enjoyment of active kind of related activity of the child interest, and also enjoy passive activity, for example, art activities. And parents also mention specific skills of their kids, and in this category we had description of like the child good memory, good gross motor skills, and additional specific skills. And last, we had other different kind of responses that were not related to any specific category, but still were describing positive trait. So we put them under other trait described by the parent. So what parents said? So at each time point, and we had 3 time points, parent identified an average of 3 positive character traits. And the top 6 traits were love, happiness, kindness, humor, intelligence, and friendliness. So I think you might agree that when most lay people think about autism spectrum disorder, these traits are not the first 6 traits that they think of. So that's kind of a nice description of the children. And also, I kind of want to mention that with this regard, in other studies of children, neurotypical children, we see that they also often describe the top 3 traits were like love, kindness, and humor, which also were described by parents of the children with autism spectrum disorder. So in terms of change over time, where 32% of the parents endorsed traits in the wisdom and knowledge category at the first time point, where kids were in preschool, and then 46 parents endorsed this category at the second time point when children were already at school. So we see increase in positive traits over time. Also, we saw this kind of trend with regard to the category of courage, where we have at the first time point like 16%, then 21, and 25. Again, we see this kind of increase over time in parents' description of courage with regard to their strength of their children. So next, we also wanted to know what educators identified in children in terms of character trait. And we look at their responses, who respond to the CBCL item that asks them specifically about the best thing about their student. And we collected their responses in 2 time points, similar to the parents when the kids actually enter school. So the second time point, again, children were around 7 to 8 years old. And the next time 3, when kids were around 10 years old. In terms of the educators, we can see that most educators were females, and they were classroom teachers. And what we can see in terms of classroom placement, the majority of kids were actually learning in regular classes with some kind of support. that's kind of within 2 time points. We have most kids were in the green here, it's the regular classroom. And also we have kids in special classes or special schools and kids in regular classes that actually receive no support. And in terms of the education curriculum that the children receive, we have 2 major kind of categories. One, children who are learning with regular and combination of regular and adapted curriculum and the modified life skill curriculum. And we had like a lower proportion of kids are kind of having any kind of combination of education curriculum, including regular, adaptive, or modified skills, life skills. So we code the responses with the VIA, the same framework that we code parents' responses, and we added 1 category and its related traits for school engagement to reflect educator response. So here, teacher mentioned things around school enjoyment, classroom participation, and progress and growth. So we code that as well. So what did educators say? So at each time point, educator identified on average, similar to the parents, 3 positive character traits. And the top 6 traits were kindness, specific skills, self-regulation, happiness, perseverance, and friendliness. And if you note and remember that the 3 of the top traits from what parents mentioned are actually the same as the one that educator mentioned, which including kind of the kindness, happiness, and friendliness. And the other 3 top traits were replaced to self-regulation, specific skill, and perseverance by the teachers. And it's probably by the unique context of the school, which kind of what teachers were more kind of referring to when describing the children, versus what parents were mentioning about the kids are loving, sense of humor, and intelligence. And of course, it doesn't say that the kids are not kind of loving, but still it's kind of not at the top 6 trait that they mentioned. And in terms of change over time, we saw that, again, educator, we see this kind of shift that increasingly when kids are getting older, there is a development range for positive, like 61% of the educator endorsed trait in the humanity category at T1, and 77% endorsed this trait at T3. And also we see the same kind of increase around friendliness, which is the specific trait within humanity. So what? So what we can say from this kind of description of the kids by educator and teacher. So our finding remind us that autistic people may have challenges, but mostly they have many positive traits and strengths. And the most common kind of stereotypic presentation of people with autism in the popular media are quite misleading. So I don't know if you're familiar with the movie, for example, Rain Man, when Hoffman is playing the brother and have a very savant skills of counting, like in the casino when he counts all the cards, but at the same time has very kind of low function skills in terms of dressing independently or cooking. So what we are finding are completely different from these descriptors, and we can see that we, as typical children or neurotypical children have a diverse strength. And so from that, we can say that our policy and services need to be flexible. And of course, we need to address the challenges, but we also need to focus on the strength and for the child and their family, of course, and to support them the best we can. So thank you, and I'm returning to Pat now.
Thanks, Anat. So we've looked at 3 studies, the Doing Well study and both of the Best Things study, which take one kind of perspective on the strengths and assets of people with autism. But of course, we want to ask people with autism about this question as well. What are strengths and assets and experiences? And that's the focus of the final study I want to share with you that we refer to as Autistic Voices. So the goal here was to capture the first person perspectives of autistic youth, because remember, our Pathways participants are now teenagers. So we wanted to talk to them about their interests, their experiences, their future goals, their self-perceptions, how they felt about autism, lots of different questions. So we interviewed 32 of the Pathways youth who ranged in age from 11 to 18. Again, they were mostly males, and these were participants who lived either in Edmonton or Montreal. So some of the interviews were conducted in French in Montreal by our bilingual interviewers. And there were two unique things about this study. We first of all wanted to include participants across the range of cognitive and communication ability. In most first-person studies, the only people who are interviewed are verbally fluent individuals who are able to articulate their responses quite clearly. But we wanted to deviate from that. And so we included 25 verbal participants. And these were individuals who, if you're familiar with the ADOS, completed the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, module 3 or 4, that requires sentence level and conversational speech. But 7 of the participants were what we refer to as minimally verbal. That is, they completed ADOS modules either 1 or 2, which require either no speech or phrase speech. Similarly, 24 of the participants had nonverbal IQ scores on the WISC of greater than 85, and 8 had nonverbal IQ scores less than 85. But the verbal ability of the participants and the IQ scores didn't always match. So 84% of the verbal participants and 43% of the minimally verbal participants had NVIQ scores greater than 85. So you see that we had participants really in 4 quadrants: high verbal, high IQ, high verbal, low IQ, low verbal, high IQ, and low verbal, low IQ, which is exactly what we wanted. So this was a deliberate sampling. The other thing that was unique about this study is that the interviewers used picture symbols both to ask questions and to suggest response options. And the participants themselves could communicate to the interviewers in many different ways. Of course, many of them used speech. One individual pointed to letters on an alphabet display to spell out words. Some of them wrote on paper or drew or used their phones to text or use emojis. And several of them used the pictures by choosing or pointing to the pictures that were provided by the interviewer. So I want to give you an idea of what these pictures looked like and how they were used. One of the questions, a series of the questions that we wanted to ask had to do with their plans for the future. What do you want to do after you graduate from high school or when you're an adult? And here's how we asked that question pretty much to everybody, whether we thought that they required it or not. The interviewer might say something like, so now you're 17 years old, assuming that that was the case, and then you'll have a birthday, and then you'll be 18 years old, and then you'll have another birthday, and then you'll be 19 years old, and then you'll be an adult, depending on the gender of the individual. And then you won't be going to school anymore, no more school. And that period of time is called the future, after you finish school, when you're an adult, when we want to talk about the future. So that was how we sort of introduced this. The interviewers were more articulate than I am about this, but that's kind of how we introduced the idea of the future. And then, for example, one of the questions we wanted to ask is what kind of job they wanted to have when they graduated. So we gave them 3 response options: a thumbs up option, a thumbs down option, and a somewhere in the middle option, and then also provided them with pictures of various job occupations if became clear that that would be helpful. So, for example, this individual said that he didn't want to be a waiter. He was ambivalent about being a cook. The computer programmer sounded like a good occupation. Being a musician was appealing. Being a police person was not. Being a librarian was not. Being a gardener was somewhere in the middle. Being an artist was somewhere in the middle. So you can see that people were able to sort the occupations here into the different piles. And we use that approach very, very frequently in many different ways as we asked different kinds of questions. So these interviews were typically about 45 minutes to an hour long. So the youth said many, many things during this period of time. I just want to share some examples of what the youth said with you. So here's one of the questions that we asked: how did you feel when you found out you have autism? And for this, we provided pictures of various emotions: happy, sad, angry, confused, whatever. This is the response of a verbal girl who was 18 years of age. She said, to be honest, I was kind of excited. I mean, I think about two of my friends, or like two people who I want to be friends with, have autism. Like I find that I get along with people who have autism quite well because they have a specific interest. And I just really like hearing people talk about things that they are passionate about. So that's her take on her experience. We also asked, how would you explain autism to someone who doesn't know what it means? Here's the response of a 17-year-old verbal boy. He said, tell me your favorite color. The interviewer responded, purple. He said, picture all the shades. The darkest one is Asperger's syndrome. The lightest one is very severe autism. The interviewer said, okay, so that's how you would explain the spectrum of different things that you can have in one single. Exactly, he said, exactly. So he's using the color spectrum to talk about the spectrum of autism. We asked, do you think there are good things about being on the autism spectrum? Here's two responses, one not so ambivalent from a 11-year-old verbal boy. He said, being unusually unique. Albert Einstein, probably, I think. We all know he has autism, and he was the smartest person, one of the smartest people. So here he focused, as did some of the parents in the Best Thing study, on intelligence. Here's a more nuanced, ambivalent response from a 15-year-old verbal boy. He said, well, it is a disability, but I guess it can also be some way unique because you can do all these different things. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't come with some downgrades. Like, I can't really look at somebody straight and then just acting in a completely different way that nobody would. So you can see that he's taking a much more kind of nuanced perspective on this question. Here's the response of a 16-year-old verbal boy whose interview was conducted in French. So I've put the English translation, which is the one that I'm going to read, in yellow. He said, what is positive is that my life is way more simple. The interviewer said, oh yeah, in what sense? And his response was, in the school, it's not like I'm able to move at my own pace, not like those in the regular program. So he saw this as a real advantage. One of the participants was a minimally verbal boy, 16 years of age. And I told you already that he communicated by pointing to letters on an alphabet display to provide his responses. This is something like what the alphabet display looked like. One of the questions that he was asked was, did you like school? And here's his response. He said, I hated it because they treated me like an idiot and presented things almost always easy. The interviewer said, was there anything you liked about school? And he said, finding friendship. Again, go back to the Best Things. Friendship was identified by both parents and teachers as a positive character trait. We asked, what are some of your strengths? And again, all of these questions were accompanied by picture cards, but this girl was a verbal girl who answered, I'm a loyal friend and I'm a good friend and I'll listen to you. Even though I have problems listening, I try my best to listen or to pretend like I am at least. And I am a good friend. So again, you see that theme of friendship coming up from the autistic youth themselves. I already showed you one example of answers to the question, what do you want to do when you're an adult, or what do you want to do after high school? Here is an exchange between a minimally verbal boy and an interviewer. And one of the interesting things about this is that this was a boy who did respond verbally to some of the questions using like 1 or 2 word responses at most. But when they got to this question, he was very animated about it. So, what do you want to do when you're an adult? The interviewer asked. Building a cinema, he said. The interviewer said, you want to build a cinema? Yes, he said. Oh, cool, said the interviewer. What would you put in the cinema? How many theaters would you have? He said, 9 screens featuring Ultra AVX. Whoa, so it would be like 9 really big screens you would build. You would build 9 big screens in your cinema? Yes, he said, and 10 Ultra AVX and 11 IMAX. He was adamant and he was talking about this. So this is also, by the way, when he used the picture cards, he talked about movies being one of his favorite things. And his father later confirmed that, yes, this was a big thing for him. So he was very, very clear about his future job aspirations. One of the questions we also asked was, what kind of relationships do you want to have after you leave school? And this boy, a verbal boy, said that he wanted to have a girlfriend. And the follow-up question from the interviewer was for what reason do you want to have a girlfriend? And he said, so that way I could just start a family that doesn't have to be fully autistic, but they need to understand me and I can understand them back. I mean, it would be cool if the whole family was autistic. So this is a boy who thought that having autism was a real asset. So the take-home message from the Autistic Voices studies clearly is that autistic youth have a lot to say, and that by listening to their voices, regardless of how they make their voices heard, and in this study, we helped them make their voices heard by using pictures and other ways of allowing them to communicate, we are able to include them as active stakeholders in research that affects them. And at the same time, of course, we promote empowerment and self-determination, and we allow them to tell us about their lives rather than going to parents and educators alone for that information. Overall, these 4 studies remind us that of the importance of looking past diagnostic labels, test scores, and behavioral challenges to focus on individual strengths toward the goal of supporting autistic people to live the lives that they define as both meaningful and fulfilling. I hope this has been interesting to you. I want to thank all the children, youth, and families who have participated in the Pathways study and all the students and trainees who have been involved over the past 2 decades. I'm sure I've left some names off here, but here is a representative sample of some of those students and trainees in particular. I also, of course, want to thank our multiple funders. And I want to thank you for joining us today. Along with Catherine and Annette, I hope this has been interesting to you as well as useful. And we have some time for questions now.
Great. Thank you, Pat, Annette, and Catherine. Jose, I had to log out and log back in. So Jose, there was a question in the chat box that I can no longer see. Do you mind letting me know?
Yes. I see there's a question from Anne that says the parents and teachers weren't required to complete this item on the CBCL/TRF. Did you look at the characteristics of the kids where the parents/teachers left this item blank? Were there any systematic differences between the kids where the field was completed versus where it wasn't?
Great question. Annette and Catherine, do you want to turn your videos back on and unmute yourself so that you can help me answer some of these questions? Annette, do you want to answer that, or do you want me to?
You can go ahead and answer.
So we did look at that. You're right; they weren't required to do anything. Some completed it, and some didn't. We did look at whether the children whose parents completed the question and didn't complete the question were different in terms of behavior problems and autism severity, and the answer is no, they were not. Did we look at anything else?
We looked for the parents. We looked at whether the parents who didn't answer the question maybe had greater depression symptoms.
Oh, right, and they did not.
And they did not.
Right. So they didn't seem. We looked at some things that we thought might differentiate parents who answered the question and parents who didn't, and none of them panned out. So great question. Thanks for asking.
Thank you.
We've got another question. Are the 6 traits described by parents and educators in order of top traits or priorities, or did you were they ranked in any way?
Those were in order. So the top trait that we showed you was the one that a larger proportion of parents or educators endorsed. They were in order.
What are your next steps and plans in this doing well and best things studies?
Catherine, do you want to talk about next steps for doing well?
So, I mean, just briefly, we're trying to use algorithms like machine learning algorithms that might give us a better idea of being able to include more factors in terms of predicting how well children are doing. So many more variables and different levels of outcomes, or how they're doing in this middle childhood and also in early adolescence. But the idea is, we're somewhat limited in the variables we could choose to be associated with doing well, and we would like to include more variables there and include some of the protective factors like friendship that children might experience early on.
Great.
I think in terms of best things, we're the teacher best things study actually hasn't been published yet. We're in the process of finalizing a submission. And once that's done, I think we're done with that line of research.
Great. To what extent were autistic young people, as well as their families, involved in the creation of the study, the formatting of the questions, those kinds of things?
The pathway study as a whole, or one of these?
One of these two.
So the Autistic Voices study, parents and youth were very much involved in the early stages. We did a sort of pilot run on this in terms of questions that would be asked, how they could be answered, all of that. In the pathway study as a whole, which took a participatory research approach at the very beginning of the pathway study, way back in 2000, 2001, 2002, when we were submitting the first grant proposal, parents and people with autism were very much involved in helping us identify the questions that were most important to them to ask in the study as a whole. So there was quite a bit of front-end loading with the pathway study overall.
Great. Carol has asked, have any individualized funding programs used these findings to determine eligible services?
No, and that would not be something that we envision happening. I don't think certainly the doing well, I mean, I can't imagine a way that could be done. that would be valid and productive. Perhaps the person who asked the question can, but I'm having trouble figuring out how that could happen. You wouldn't only provide services to people who you can anticipate will be doing well. You would need to provide services to everyone. And yeah.
What are the main implications of your studies on service delivery, the focus on doing well and best things? What are the main implications for clinicians and for people with autism?
Annette, Catherine, do you want to take one of that?
I can say that in terms of like best thing is really remember the diversity among children, youth, and adults with autism, and always remember kind of a balanced view that they have both challenges but strength, and it's also dynamic because they change over time. So we have to be very flexible and also kind of adjust ourselves to people with autism in terms of their strength and interests and needs, as well as their challenges, to have kind of a more holistic kind of view in kind of how we support kind of strength-based services.
Great.
Anything you want to add, Catherine or Pat, for that? In terms of doing well, maybe? I don't know.
We're at the end of our questions. Any last-minute key messages you want to share with our audience?
Well, I mean, again, I think I go back to the idea of positive psychology. We spend a lot of time in autism sometimes looking at people's deficits and what people can't do. And we think that it's really important to focus on the assets and the strengths. That, as Annette said, though, that not only has implications for delivery of services in school, but also will have implications for delivery of services post-school and delivery of services to families. I mean, we wish we had measures in the study that looked specifically at family strengths and family assets in a more focused kind of way. And as Catherine said, that is hopefully going to be one of the focuses of the doing well follow-up. So, you know, it's about shining a light on the positive and not always focusing on the negative, which, you know, sometimes we do more than we realize.
Yeah, absolutely. Annette, Catherine, any last minute key messages you want to pass on?
I think Pat presented kind of our key message very well.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yes, Pat did a great job of summarizing.
So that's the end of our time together today. I want to thank Pat, Catherine, and Annette for sharing your time and expertise with us. And thank you for the Pathways study for your continued interest in our webinar series. Thank you to all of our members and other attendees for choosing to join us today. We know how busy you are right now, and we hope you depart with some practical knowledge to bring back to your organization. Join us on June 9th at 11 a.m. Eastern, when we're pleased to bring you the final of this three-part series, Pathways in Autism Spectrum Disorder, Mental Health Risk and Resilience. We invite you to save the date for our 2021 annual conference taking place virtually from November 22nd to 26th, 2021. The theme this year is From Crisis to Catalyst, the next chapter for children's healthcare. And our call for abstracts for the poster sessions and member spotlight sessions is open until June 13th. It's always great if you can watch live, as your questions and comments enrich the discussion. But if you can't, the recordings of these sessions are made available after the fact on our Knowledge Exchange Network. So thanks again for joining us today. Thanks to Pat, Catherine, and Annette for the rest of the Pathways in Autism Spectrum Disorder study team for this presentation. And hopefully we'll see many of you back here on June 9th. Bye, everyone.